We want to welcome Eric Stevens with us yet again. For those of you who are not familiar with Eric, he's a shareholder here at the Nashville office of the firm Littler Mendelson, which is a global employment and labor practice firm. Eric, in addition to counseling his clients on administrative investigations and employment litigation, regularly provides training and guidance on compliance and litigation avoidance, which is we're very grateful for because he does that for us a lot, not only here at GCFA, but for all of you. We're very grateful for all the time that he spends to provide these types of conversations for us and to let us know what we should be doing. So again, Eric, thank you for being here today, and we'll go ahead.
All right, thank you all. It's always a privilege. Those of you that are not in the room with us, this sounds a little bit different. We are under a tornado watch, and we're all huddled under the desk right now. So it sounds a little bit different on the speakerphone, but hopefully I've been told that my voice projects without a microphone, so hopefully there won't be any problems hearing me. When we were talking about some different training opportunities for this year, one of the things that we came up with, it's curious because performance management as a legal issue has changed very little over the years. Technology has allowed us to change the way that we manage performance, and some of the laws that apply to how we treat our employees have changed, but really the performance management process itself has changed very little over the years. Ironically, the performance management process is still one of the biggest challenges that employers have for any number of reasons, and we're going to talk through some of those today, and hopefully when we complete this, we will be more effective and more efficient at actually managing performance as well as completing evaluations and not simply looking at this as a way to document difficulties and issues. One of the things when we talk about performance management, our thoughts tend to go towards the employees that are perhaps problem employees, the ones that require to be, quote, written up. I guess the best way to start this off is with the question of exactly which employees need performance. With apologies to those of you that watch really old Westerns on the Wii channel, should it be to the good, to the bad, to the ugly? I brought a few of these little gems from performance evaluations. Please do not write these down. Please do not use these in your performance evaluation, although you may wish you had at some point in time. The first one, since his last evaluation, this employee has reached rock bottom and has started to dig. This person works well under constant supervision and when cornered like a rat in a trap. If you see two people talking, one looks bored, he's the other one. If you give him a penny for your thoughts, you'll get change. This employee should go far, and the sooner the better. And of course, the one that's my favorite, you've probably seen before, somewhere there's a village that's missing its idiot. I'm satisfied that at some point in time you may have felt at least tempted. Please resist that temptation to use those in your performance evaluations. But I think the point of that is, who needs performance management? The good, yes. And we're going to talk about managing good performers. The bad, yes. The ugly, of course, if you're going to do it that way, certainly with tact. But yes, all of our employees need some level of performance management because performance management is not simply an outgrowth of punishment, if you will, or disciplinary action, but it really is, we need to be looking at it as managing the performance of all of our employees, because the goal is really to make sure that we have an environment where employees are able to make their own choice to do his or her part to meet our goals. And really, performance management, one of the things that I've learned over the years is we can't fix folks. We can offer our employees the most opportunities and the best tools and the best setting, and then allow them to make the choice whether to use those or not to use those. And we want to make sure that they have every opportunity to be successful, or unfortunately in some cases that they have the appropriate opportunities to work themselves to where they're successful somewhere else. Let's talk just a few general insights on performance management as a consideration. First of all, let me ask this, and I realize that as I ask this question, no one can answer me back because they're all Everyone is muted. But think about this. How would you and your managers answer this question? How much of every day is really devoted to feedback, coaching, and development? Now, when you think about the answer to that, folks might think about, well, I only do performance evaluations once a year, or I only do write-ups on Fridays, or I do one or the other. But when you start to think about how much of every day is devoted to feedback, coaching, and development, one of the things that I would suggest is that the percentage should go up as you go higher in the management chain. Now, what you will find is when most employees, particularly mid and lower level managers, are asked that question, they will typically respond that more of their day is devoted to feedback, coaching, and development. And I think part of this is a matter of perception of what exactly is performance management and when exactly are we doing that. I would suggest that these management practices are certainly the first step in confronting and preventing potential employment problems, but it's more than just addressing problems in the workplace. But it's very important that all of us as managers, whether first-line managers or top-line managers, make the commitment that we are managing the performance, that we are offering those opportunities to our employees. This is a quote from Jack Welch. I like this. Jack Welch used to be former chair and CEO of General Electric. You can read it for yourself, but I view my primary job as strengthening our talent pools. I view every conversation as an opportunity to help managers with their talents and their priorities. Think about that for a minute. I would suspect that most of us could not honestly say that I view every conversation as an opportunity to help managers. If so, that's great. That's a great outlook on management. I think oftentimes we get into the weeds. There's a story back in the days when we were in the space race, and President Kennedy had just announced that we would be the first country to place someone on the moon, and there were some dignitaries that were walking through NASA. And folks were asking, what do you do? What do you do? And somewhat tongue-in-cheek, one of the dignitaries came up on someone who was mopping a floor, and he asked that individual, and what do you do here? And without missing a beat, the individual mopping the floor said, I'm helping put a man on the moon. If we can get our folks to recognize that everything, and when I say our folks, particularly our managerial level folks, to recognize that all that we do should be centered on performance management, and thinking that whatever we do is centered on performance management, then we will have a much better perspective on how we're handling that. It should not be an interruption in our daily work. It should be part of our daily work. One of the things, and some of you have heard me use this example before, when my son was in second grade and brought home a little stick wrapped up in water or in a wet newspaper, and we stuck it in the ground dutifully, and about 17 years later, when he hit it with a lawnmower, as most teenagers do, didn't realize a tree was there and asked me, when did the tree get that big? And my very thoughtful answer that I just guessed at the time, I said, well, I guess every day. And that's really the way we look at it with performance management. Performance management should really begin the first day of an employee's exposure to the company. I would suggest that we need to look at performance management as something that even begins during the recruiting and the selection process, because oftentimes it's during the recruiting and the selection process that individuals get a better feel for us, that they understand our culture, and then the performance management does not end until the employee's employment ends. And termination does not necessarily mean termination as far as you are fired, but the termination of the employment, whether it is by resignation, whether it is by retirement, whether it is by the employee is called somewhere else, any of those endings. So let's talk a little bit about how we might manage performance before we have to step into the realm of corrective actions. Again, as I mentioned earlier, it's important that early and often we set clear expectations and we set clear goals. Managing the expectations of our employees is critical, because much of how effective employment or performance management will be is how effective or how much the employees buy into that system, buy into that performance management. If employees feel that they are being treated fairly, they may disagree with the conclusions that we have, but if they feel they are being treated fairly, it is much more likely that they are going to buy into our performance management and the expectations that we place on them. And much of the notion of being treated fairly is what their expectations and goals are. In other words, if they have unreasonable expectations of their managers, if they have unreasonable expectations of the organization, if they just have unreasonable expectations of work in general, then as performance management becomes something less than positive or perhaps not as encouraging as they would like for it to be, they're going to be missing those expectations, and there's going to at least be a sense of unfairness. That's why it's important when we set goals and we explain what those goals are, that we explain that those goals are really goals that are important not only to them, to the employee, but also how they fit in and how they are important to the overall operation of the organization and whichever of the agencies they may be working with or for. When we're talking about positively improving performance of employees, and again, this is all before you would have to take any disciplinary actions, we want to look at what resources are we really providing employees and what resources should we be providing employees. One of the resources, oftentimes when we think of resources, we think of electronics and technology and financial and access and the like, but one of the most critical resources is the collective knowledge of those in the department. Sometimes it's a little difficult to tactfully assess that, and sometimes in discussion it's a little difficult to tactfully discuss that. But do we really and are we really providing enough of the knowledge resources to our employees? Do they really have folks to whom they can go, either for mentoring, simply for technical advice, or perhaps just for some good old-fashioned wisdom? Do we have enough resources in the nature of people assigned to whatever the task, whatever the department, whatever the responsibilities may be? Are we putting folks in a position where they will not be successful because there are not enough folks assigned to whatever that task may be? A corollary to that is the time that may be available for them to perform their job, whatever that may be. If you have someone who is, for example, a non-exempt individual who is eligible for overtime, and you have a policy that you cannot work overtime, there's nothing illegal about that policy. But if we are expecting employees to complete a task within 40 hours and we are giving them 50 hours worth of work, then much like a pressure cooker, at some point in time, that pressure will build to where it has to be released somewhere. It can be released anywhere from poor performance to falsifying time records, to working off the clock, to making complaints to the appropriate governmental agencies, and none of those are the results that we're really looking for. So are we really giving the employees enough time as a resource to make sure that they are performing appropriately? And then, of course, the appropriate equipment. Sometimes that is within our authority, depending upon our level of management, and sometimes it is not. Enough information. I have often been perplexed when someone would tell me that or I would usually find out in a deposition that someone would go to their manager and they would say, I have a question about a policy, and the first response is, why are you asking? That is not the best response for any number of reasons, particularly when we have employees that need the resources of institutional information about how we do things, about what we do, how transparent we may be. When the first response is, why do you ask, it causes people to tend to feel perhaps a bit intimidated, and certainly less likely to seek out the information that they may need from the appropriate sources. And then part of that resource, too, is just letting them know where do we go for help. That second main bullet point, I think sometimes people look at that and they think, teach, don't do. That seems to be counterintuitive. I thought as a manager, I'm supposed to lead by example. I'm supposed to say, watch me do this and learn from me. Well, to some extent, that is still appropriate, but sometimes managers, particularly with new employees or newly promoted employees, have a tendency to simply say, oh, here, just give that to me. It's easier for me to do it than it is to teach you how to do it. First of all, that's very demeaning. It is very disparaging of someone who would like to learn. But secondly, as a manager, if the way that you teach folks is to say, here, give that to me and I'll do it, do not be surprised if that is the type of employee that you tend to cultivate, which is, here, you need to do this for me. So as we're providing resources and as we are trying to assist particularly new employees, new in the organization or new in a position, to develop in their position, make sure that we take the time to teach folks, even though we recognize, yes, indeed, you can probably do it faster than they can, which is why you are their manager, and which is why if you want to remain their manager, you will teach them how to do that so that you do not have to continue to fulfill their responsibilities and then later wind up in a performance evaluation saying that they cannot perform. I would suggest that oftentimes when supervisors are critical of employees because they cannot perform a particular task, managers are open themselves up to their own criticism of why have you not taught them that task. So teach, don't do. And as soon as I said that, Corey started to hit the advance because he didn't think I knew how to hit the button, and in fact I didn't. So thanks, Corey. As we're improving that, again, we want to make sure that, talking about performance improvement, we do want to make sure that we give folks the best opportunity to do what they do best. There is a reason why in manufacturing facilities that the same person does not sell the car and build the car. There is a reason that we have divisions of responsibilities. We all have strengths and weaknesses. Even the best of your employees have strengths and they have weaknesses. It's important for us both to manage towards the strengths and also allow opportunity and allow the tools to improve on those weaknesses, but to always understand that no employee is going to be strong in every area. So remember that as we manage folks, that we have to at least appreciate that. Folks are going to have different interests. They're going to have different desires. They're going to have different goals. They're going to have different learning styles. As you are working with your folks, as you are training your employees, as you are managing them through performance issues, try to recognize and try to lead to or teach to whatever is their best learning style. Some of their learning styles may not be to sit across the desk from you and listen to you tell them how to do something. It may be more of a kinetic type of approach of let's do this together to really develop muscle/brain memory in performing that duty, that responsibility while I'm working with you. So understand different leadership styles, understand different learning styles, and understand that everyone has different interests, desires, and goals. Some of the examples that you give, particularly to some of your younger employees that you're managing, they may look at you with the look that sometimes I get when I give examples in some of these training, and I realize that no one really understands the example that I'm using. So appreciate the fact that everyone doesn't come from the same background. They're not always going to get the same point unless you make it in more than one way. And that really does take a two-pronged approach, both our analysis, your analysis as a manager of the employee's strengths, but also asking the employees, is this working? Again, you want to be very careful how you do that. You don't want to be gazing deep into their eyes and ask them, can you understand me? But at the same point, getting feedback from the employees helps us to develop for them the opportunities for them to do and learn and perform the way they do best. As you're setting these goals, again, we want to make sure that the expectations that we set for them are realistic, and we want to make sure that we're actually analyzing them based upon objective factors and not necessarily our more subjective factors, and not just first impressions or perhaps a bad experience at one time. It's important that we provide feedback often and we provide it effectively. That means that feedback is going to be positive as well as negative, and that feedback is effective when we give it. Constructive criticism, and I want to drop down to point 2 very quickly to start out with, and that is constructive criticism is not necessarily negative, but we need to be very careful that we are clear that we are trying to provide information that is not negative when we talk about constructive criticism. It simply means that whatever we're doing or tried to do didn't work this time, it wasn't effective, it didn't accomplish the goals. So next time, let's try to figure out a different way to do it. Certainly, constructive criticism needs to be prompt. It needs to be face-to-face. It should be done in private. Prompt does not mean knee-jerk. Prompt means within a reasonable amount of time so that you can gather your thoughts, gather the appropriate information, and be prepared to address the employee. Face-to-face is, I think, still better even than in an email, because you can get better interaction and you don't necessarily initiate an email dialogue that could go on for a long time, and you control the meeting more. You certainly want to explain why the constructive criticism matters, because employees don't want to feel like they're just being picked on. And if, in fact, that is a feeling that we give, even if it is an inaccurate feeling, the criticism, the constructive criticism, is not going to be effective. Okay, there we go. And then, of course, we want to make sure that we are allowing the employee to ask questions, and that we're also asking questions to make sure that we do understand what the issues are and to follow up on that constructive criticism. And we're going to talk a little bit more now and kind of peel back some of the layers of managing substandard performance. There's really 6 steps that we're going to go through and go through them fairly quickly. And the first step is, of course, to assess the situation, look at some possible solutions, make sure that we are consistent in how we address performance deficiencies, document both the problem and our plan for addressing them, all of that before we even meet and discuss it with the employee, and then talk a little bit about following up on managing performance. So step 1 is to assess the problem. What really is the problem? What is the performance deficiency that you need to address? There are going to be some problems you can solve. There are some problems you cannot solve. And I think it's important as a manager for us to understand that, because performance problems that are related to how an employee carries out a responsibility, that employee's competency, that employee's the tools that they may have available for them. Those are the types of problems that you may be able to solve. There are some problems that as a manager, no matter how hard we try, we cannot solve those problems. Remember, employees come to work bringing all of their life with them. There very well may be a problem in that employee's life at home, with a family member, with a friend, something that you do not know of, something of which you should not be asking, and something that you could not necessarily solve even if you knew question A and B. So recognize the fact that even the best managers cannot solve every problem. You need to set your own reasonable expectations in managing performance deficiencies, to recognize that there will be some that you simply will not be able to solve. When you're looking at the problem, you want to try to assess how serious the problem is. And you can do that by asking yourself a number of questions. How long has the employee been here? If this is a problem that has gone on for years, it is a serious problem. If the employee has been here for a very, very short period of time, it could either be a lapse of judgment, or it could have just been a bad decision that the employee made because they simply did not have enough time in the position to really know how to respond. How does the problem impact the workflow, production, productivity, the public's impression of us, our ministry, depending upon what that employee's responsibilities may be, and looking at how the problem might impact those. How does the problem impact other employees? And it certainly could be by morale. If employees see that this employee is being permitted to continue to work with clear performance deficiencies, others may feel that they're not being fairly treated, and so we need to be sensitive to that. Again, being also sensitive to the fact that sometimes we cannot tell other employees why we are doing what we're doing. But how serious is the problem? We need to assess that. There are some performance issues that may even require an investigation. If those performance issues are dealing with the way an employee may be treating time, maybe treating finances, maybe treating other employees, then you need to consider, do I need to, as a manager, conduct more of an investigation? And I want to be careful, because when you hear the word investigation, oftentimes, and particularly when a lawyer is anywhere close to the room, we think that's a, quote, formal investigation. We're going to bring somebody in. We're going to swear everybody in under oath. We're going to take depositions. And it's not necessarily that. Sometimes an investigation is nothing more than asking someone else what happened. An investigation may be nothing more than looking at the working papers of the employee to try to figure out what happened. But should you look into the situation more than simply taking it on face value in determining how serious is this problem? One of the ways to evaluate the seriousness of a problem is the repetitive nature of it, the frequency of the problem, and if there's any mitigating circumstances that surround the problem or that surround the individual that's engaging in the poor performance. Once we've looked at the problem, then we need to start assessing possible solutions, and that's sort of your toolbox. When most Saturdays, you'll find me at Home Depot 3 times. The first time is to go pick up the things that I need for whatever projects I have. The second time is to go because I've forgotten it the first time, and the third time is to go pick up stuff that I've broken from the first 2. I was in Home Depot one Saturday morning, and there were a bunch of children that were at a little table, and they were all building birdhouses. And one of the children had somehow, and they were all just wailing away on these little nails. Whack, 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 whack. You could hear them. Sounded like, Santa's little elves over there. Anyway, this one little boy had somehow managed to pick up a screw, and he was just wailing on that screw. And as you might imagine, it is very difficult if you've ever tried to hammer a screw. It's not the easiest thing to do. Well, the person who was sort of over the group happened to notice the little boy having trouble and came over and very, very nicely said, "Here, son, somehow you picked up a screw. Why don't you try this nail instead?" Well, the little boy looks at the screw and just says, "Stupid screw," and puts it down and starts to drive in a nail. Well, there is a lesson to be learned almost anywhere, and there is a quote that is not mine, but that is that if you look at every problem as if it is a nail, your only solution is the hammer. And that very much was what I saw that morning. Was that little boy, if he'd had a screwdriver, he'd had the best built and most stable birdhouse of anybody. But instead, he was using the wrong tool. So as managers, as we are looking at performance management, we need to look at what tools are we going to use. The tools in our toolbox may be coaching. It may be termination. It may be training. It could be any other additional resources, retraining, additional computer resources, or perhaps some other sort of corrective action, performance management, anything from a verbal to a suspension to a last chance agreement. Performance coachings versus corrective actions, because again, as we're looking at managing poor performance, we need to think through what exactly is it that we are managing. Is this truly a performance issue where the employee is not fulfilling their job responsibilities, or are they violating a policy or engaging in inappropriate behavior? Performance coaching approaches typically are not successful and typically are not even recommended if you have a true policy violation. If you have someone that is falsifying their time, a performance coaching is probably not necessary and is probably not going to be successful anyway. All that's done is let them know, we caught you once, be better at it next time. And that's not necessarily the goal of a performance coaching. Conversely, if you have someone who simply, you realize they are trying, but there is something that is causing them not to be successful, then a performance coaching is much more of a supportive type of approach and is much more of a collaborative type of approach than perhaps immediately going to some sort of documented corrective action. So think about how am I going to address that based upon, is this a performance issue or an objective violation of a policy. In developing your plan, you want to make sure that you're task-oriented. You want to make sure that you are specific in what the expectations are for the employee. It's amazing. I see performance improvement plans that say, follow our policies, or don't let this happen again. That's not particularly insightful. It's not particularly instructive, and it's really hard to go back later and say you did not meet this expectation because the person that wrote it can't really explain what it is. Make sure that you set a timetable. And, sometimes folks ask me, particularly if you're already at the level of a performance improvement plan, how long should they be? And my recommendation is they need to be sufficiently long that the employee can realistically improve on whatever that performance may be. If this is and also I think it needs to be have somewhat of a correlation to how long has this been going on. If there's been a performance deficiency that's gone on for 3 years, giving someone a 30-day performance improvement plan would appear to be somewhat pretextual. It would appear that what you're doing is you're documenting them to fail. I'm not saying that you need to put someone on a 3-year performance improvement plan, but that might be one that you may need to give someone 90 days. But make sure that you are setting a realistic timetable and not one that either effectively or in appearance gives the appearance that all that you're doing is simply documenting their failure. And then you certainly want to make sure that you explain the consequences to not meeting that corrective action plan. Step 3, before you've met with the employee while you're developing the plan, is to make sure that you are being consistent. And that's going to require a little bit of homework on your part, and that is to make sure that how have we done this before? Look at the policies and procedures, look at the jobs, the history of this employee and any other employees in the past. Are we holding this employee to the same standards as we have others? Are there comparators that when I meet with this employee, they're going to say, well, what about Joe, who's been allowed to do this for the last 6 years? Now, does that mean that we can never change the way that we address performance issues? The answer to that is no. If there is a performance issue that has been allowed to go on that is inappropriate, that does not mean that we can never address it, but it does mean that we probably cannot address it as immediately as we would like to. And we need to make sure that we give folks the opportunity to change and improve based upon what would really be not necessarily new expectations, but a more robust enforcement of the expectations that have been there in the past. Once you've done all of that, then it's time to document both the problem and document the plan that you are going to carry out. Why do you want to document it? Well, first of all, it allows you to organize your thoughts, and it prepares a script for your meeting with the employee. A few slides back, I mentioned that it's important that you address performance issues promptly. I know you're thinking, well, promptly, we're already on step 4, and I still haven't met with the employee. That means that some of these need to be addressed fairly quickly because you do want this to be prompt. But you do not want the meeting to be impromptu. And so that's why it's important to document both the issue and your plan, whether it's a full-blown performance improvement plan or whether your plan is simply to monitor performance and to perhaps check in more often. But it does give you a script for the meeting. It also helps you to stay on task and to help the employee know what the expectations are. It also helps to avoid later confusion. What did we discuss in that meeting? And if, in fact, if you will, the wheels fall off the wagon and we all wind up over at 8th and Broad or whatever jurisdiction you may be in, then we do have documentation that's important for supporting the decisions that we've made. So documenting what we do is important. The who, what, where, when, specific examples, the why and the how are important when you're documenting both the performance issue and documenting the plan that you're going to present to the employee. You want to make sure after you have done that documentation, after you've given all that consideration, then we come to meeting with the employee. Make sure that you have those steps nailed down. Make sure that you know what you are going to say about what the problem is, about what needs to be done to solve it, about what the expectations and the potential ramifications will be if the problem is not solved, and how are we going to solve the problem together. If you leave any of those out, it's like a table that only has 3 legs. And so you want to make sure that the employee is educated to what the problem is, understands the importance of it, understands the ramifications of it, and understands that we are going to work with them to correct that problem. Now, how we work with them may be an expectation that they will not talk that way to their subordinates again. That's fine for how we're going to solve it. Or it may be how we're going to provide you retraining on a particular computer program that you're struggling with. So how we're going to solve it is going to vary depending upon the nature of the problem. You want to make sure when you have the meeting, and oftentimes how you do this is as important as the substance of what is said. Mentioned earlier, meetings should be in private. Questions are always raised, should I have someone with me in the meeting? Again, there is no bright line answer for that. It is exceptionally difficult to have someone in a meeting with you each time you address performance issues with an employee, particularly if they are performance coachings, if they're fairly informal. And so in those types of situations, generally it's not necessary. If you are, and one of the things, and some of y'all have probably read this as well, but one of the things I have found interesting is sort of the reaction, if you will, or the pendulum swinging so far the other way with the hashtag #MeToo movement, and the notion that male managers are now reluctant to either mentor or be in a room with female managers, or vice versa. I would suggest that while that is not something that necessarily needs to be a reason to have someone in the room with you, because if you stop and think about it, in this room I look around and there is some differentiating factor between me and everyone in this room. And so if that is my concern, it's going to be very difficult for me to then go find the person who has all of the characteristics of both myself and that individual, or someone who has all of the characteristics of the individual of whom I'm concerned. All that is to say, do not overreact to the notion of must I have a witness. Now, when you are getting to the point of addressing situations that could result in a more significant adverse action, a suspension, a performance improvement plan, likely even a final written warning, and certainly a termination, then yes, those need to be planned with someone else. But getting back to this particular slide, you want to make sure that the meeting is not a confrontational setting, even if it's a termination. You want to make sure that the employee gets, if it is in writing, that they get a copy of whatever that evaluation is or whatever the written concerns are, and encourage their feedback. And you want to make sure that you're avoiding jokes and sarcasm. Unfortunately, some folks, that is sort of a defense mechanism for the manager. They don't really know how to start, so they start with a joke. There is a reason why none of you work at Zanies. Those of you that don't know what that is, it is a comedy club here in Nashville. I certainly know from personal experience that I'm not nearly as funny as I think I am. I get that a lot. None of us are. So we need to be very careful that we don't try to diffuse the situation. I know there's a couple in here that are just hilarious. But nonetheless, try not to diffuse the situation by using a joke or sarcasm, because that will come back to haunt you, particularly if you're deposed. Again, you want to make sure that you're explaining the situation, explaining the behavior that's being addressed, explaining the impact, and get an agreement. And when I say get an agreement from the employee is not always going to agree what I've done is wrong. And I have seen employers before, and this is something that you may want to think through, and certainly when we get to the question and answer time, raise that question if you have it. But I've seen employers that will say, I want you to sign this, whatever it is, written warning, final written warning, whatever, and the employee says, I won't sign it. Okay, well then do I treat that, I'm ordering you to sign this. It doesn't say that you agree that you've done this, but I'm ordering you to sign this because it is documentation that we've had this meeting. I refuse to sign it. You're insubordinate. You're fired. And you need to use discretion and diffuse the situation. Keep in mind what the goal is. The goal is to document that you have had this meeting. If, in fact, the employee is adamant and refuses, then simply write on there the employee was adamant and refused to sign this, even after it being explained that they were not agreeing that they engaged in this behavior. They were counseled on their insubordinate conduct. But do not fire somebody simply for that, because, again, it will appear to a jury at some point later that you were really just wanting to egg them onto a situation where they got fired. So be very careful with that. Employees sometimes do not respond as we would like. We want to make sure that we don't continue the meeting if the employee does become irrational. You may have to call a break, call a timeout, and say we're going to resume this at another time. That next time it may be necessary to have security closer by. Excuse me, although I would not suggest having security in the room. That very seldom leads to anything profitable in the meeting. And again, you want to be careful to avoid just a volley of emails back and forth. One of the biggest downsides to emails is there really is no end. And if you get into an exchange, it could go on as long as you have enough paper to write your emails on. You get my point. So avoid a volley of emails back and forth. It's fine at some point to say, we have addressed this. There is no purpose in further communication on this issue. If you would like to communicate with how you are going to improve your performance, you may do that, but this issue is closed, and put an end to those types of unnecessary and useless exchanges. And then the follow-up with employees after that. And follow-up needs to be really two phases. One is following up with your documentation, and the other is following up with the employee. But certainly for your own documentation, particularly if the meeting does not go well, you want to make sure you're documenting the employee's reactions. But even if it does go well, it's good just to know the employee was open to my suggestions, and I'm looking forward to them successfully improving their performance, something like that. Make sure that you document that the interview, the meeting, whatever occurred. If you can get the employee's signature, that is good to get, but it is not absolutely critical if you have to write in that they refuse to sign. And then make sure that the document goes to HR if you do it as a manager, and make sure that it goes in the personnel file. I would strongly discourage keeping your own shadow files, or your own, employers a lot of times keep their own, quote, working files, and they treat them as some sort of, quote, not formal file. Any records that the employer keeps are technically records of the employer, and sometimes you can keep your own files, and that can be problematic. So I would suggest that practice not be maintained, particularly if it's your own personal practice and not the organization's practice. And again, following up with the employees, not only documenting, but also following up with them as far as, is it going well? If it is, nothing wrong with congratulating them on that. If it's going badly, you may want to reassess your action plan. One of the things I always want to point out with the performance improvement plan, if someone's put on a 90-day performance improvement plan, that is not a guarantee of 90 days of employment. And you want to make sure that you're clear in that this is not a guarantee of 90 days. If we do not see improvement throughout the 90 days, then we will reevaluate whether this is effective. and you may have to take more serious action. And certainly follow-up needs to be prompt as well. Regular performance evaluations, and I use the term regular rather than annual because some employers use quarterly, some employers do semi-annually, some employers do once every decade, but handling regular performance evaluations. I will tell you that in the litigation realm, performance evaluations can be either one of the most effective or one of the greatest vulnerabilities to defending a lawsuit, because it is Exhibit A for someone, and oftentimes we find that we are guilty of developing Exhibit A for the plaintiff. Written performance evaluations should be done at least annually. If you're not getting them done annually, you're really not giving much feedback at all. I would suggest that annual evaluations are there are some real deficits to annual evaluations. It does allow an employee to sort of just coast along for 11 months before they get their evaluation. It also allows the managers sometimes to perhaps be a bit less accurate on their evaluations. We have a tendency in performance evaluations to document based upon the most recent events and the worst events, the things that stick out in our mind and the things that happened most recently. That is not necessarily an effective reflection of the employee's entire year's evaluation. I think performance evaluations really need to be tied into either using the job description as the template, or at least making sure that the job description is attached to the performance evaluation as you're going through that. You want to make sure that you're accurately reviewing the entire period, not just the worst. You want to make sure that you're being honest and not passing on poor performance. We're going to talk about that more in detail in just a minute. You want to make sure that you are providing sufficient detail, that you are providing objective statements, and the evaluation, if it is done well, the employee should be able to look at that and think that they are looking in a mirror. Here's some examples of good and bad documentation. Not a team player. I don't know where in management school that is taught, but it is almost rote for most managers. Not a team player. That is very inarticulate. It is very inaccurate. It leaves open the opportunity for people to say that your team is racist, is ageist, is fill in the ist, because team simply means you're not like the rest of us, and that is not necessarily a bad thing. You see what the example is of good documentation of the same issues, but documenting specifics rather than simply a generic conclusion. Not our image. Again, the image, much like the team, is problematic and, again, is somewhat lazy. Doesn't fit in well. Again, goes back to, does that mean that there are issues with your team that need to be addressed or issues with the employee? You see a better way to document the same issues, his interaction with his coworkers, and how his gruff approach to coworkers is affecting their interaction with him. Unreliable. Be very careful with that, because that can have all sorts of hints of that means that they take too much FMLA, or if they are on intermittent FMLA, that we really can't rely on them because we never know when they're going to go out on a leave of absence. You need to be very careful. Now, this one on the good, I would suggest that there is still an issue with that one. Was out sick 10 days of the last 4 months. You need to be careful with that. The reason that we drafted this one this way is because it is not always inappropriate to avoid this. If the sick time is not protected by FMLA, if they are simply taking sick leave, then it may be something that can be addressed, but I would suggest that you be very careful in doing so. So be very careful with that being in there if you address that. You can't get through any presentation from a lawyer without coming up with an acronym. And this one is be smart with your feedback, be specific, not general. We looked at some of those generals. Be measurable. As much as possible, provide objective measures that are not as susceptible to argument. Be action-oriented and align your feedback with that action orientation. Be realistic. Make sure that your expectations truly are realistic, and give them some time that they are going to be expected to improve their performance so that they know what's expected and you know what's expected, and they will know when to expect to hear on that feedback. Some of you may remember Garrison Keillor and Lake Wobegon syndrome. Lake Wobegon syndrome is all of our children are above average. That oftentimes shows up in your annual or your regular performance evaluations. One thing I can tell you, because people ask me all the time, what is the best way to evaluate performance? Should we use, I have seen a 100-point scale, I have seen a 3-point scale, I have seen a 2-point scale. That one really confused me because there, other than the fact that it's pretty simple math unless you're going to do an average. But nonetheless, there is no perfect, quote, scale. Some folks have gone away from scales altogether. The best is the one that best reflects your job titles, best reflects what is expected of the employees, and best reflects how they can learn from that evaluation. But avoiding Lake Wobegon, supervisors that give underperformers satisfactory or even positive performance evaluations. I mentioned the 100-point evaluation, and the Vice President of Human Resources for that employer one time came to me and said, we're about to terminate this employee. And I said, well, what are her performance evaluations look like? She said, well, she has an average of 97%, and everybody knows that puts you in line to be terminated, because everybody gets 100 in this organization. So underperformers that get satisfactory or positive performance evaluations, it happens for a lot of reasons. Supervisors don't want to hurt people's feelings. They think that it's going to affect their morale and discourage them. They don't want to confront employees. They think that this particular employee is litigious, or perhaps they're carrying around a notepad or a recorder and I realize now everybody has a smartphone, nobody has a tape recorder, but they're carrying something around now that they record with. Or it could be that supervisors simply favor some employees over others. Could be the supervisor waits till the last minute and then just fills them all in. Or they have not really been keeping track of their employees and they don't remember. Or quite frankly, number 8, that the supervisor is just lazy. One of my recommendations to managers at every level is the managers that you supervise should be evaluated on the quality of their evaluations. If you are not looking at your manager's evaluations of their direct reports, then you are not fully fulfilling your responsibilities as a manager, and you are not providing them with appropriate feedback on how they should be managing their subordinates. Satisfied that I've probably offended everyone in a position to fire me at that point, but it is a point that needs to be made, because oftentimes we hand out evaluations and we expect the first line managers to do them, and the second line or above see their responsibility as to make sure they get in on time, check the box that they have them, sometimes sign off if we're about to fire someone, but otherwise that's the extent of their responsibility. And my suggestion, my recommendation is it is not, and that should be reevaluated. So how do we hold our managers accountable for this harmful practice of Lake Wobegon syndrome? First of all is, as I mentioned before, make sure that they are in fact accountable, that in their evaluations there is the opportunity to give them feedback on your evaluations are not providing satisfactory expectations to your direct reports. We want to make sure that our managers are retaining the documentation that supports their evaluations. If they do that, then they will not be able to keep giving these somewhat unrealistic evaluations when, in fact, they're required to keep documentation that's inconsistent with it. Make sure that as you get higher up the management chain that you are training your managers on performance evaluations and how to do that. We want to make sure that we provide our supervisors with clear expectations. Again, if the only expectation we provide our supervisors is get it in on time, then we're not really providing them with the support that we need to provide them. We want to make sure that, again, to encourage our supervisors, that they look at the job descriptions before they start filling out the evaluations. And I think a second level of review, while some folks will probably roll their eyes thinking they do not have time to do that, a second level of review on an annual evaluation is a very good practice. There's going to be some circumstances where you are going to find out that you have a Lake Wobegon syndrome that has gone on, and now what do I do? This person should have been fired, and instead they've gotten above expectations for the last 6 years. Well, the first answer is no, you can't turn around and fire them, because whether you like it or not, you have created part of this problem. And so we have to deal with it in a different way. But does that mean that we are forever locked in with those evaluations? The answer to that is no as well. The answer to that is typically a higher level manager is going to have to step in, but clarify those expectations. Let the employee know we have looked at your evaluations in the past, and while, yes, in fact, they are quite high, looking at your actual performance, your evaluations are not reflecting your performance. That is not going to continue. And we are going to address that both at the supervisory level and at your level, but your performance must improve. The point of this slide is you are not locked in forever if you have a supervisor who has been falling down on their responsibilities. So very quickly to wrap it up and hopefully to have a little bit of time for questions, the top 10 best practices. Make sure that you're using objective criteria. Make sure that you immediately document particularly unsatisfactory performance. Don't wait until the annual evaluation. Allow the employees the opportunity to provide feedback when you are conducting performance management. Make sure they feel that they're invested in it. If there are performance shortcomings that are material, make sure that you are providing detail on that. Specific expectations going forward. Provide assistance. Don't simply tell someone they're doing poorly and then go back and think that you've managed them well. Figure out how you can help them overcome that. Follow up with performance management plans. Make sure that you are following policies both on evaluations as well as expectations. Make sure that you're not making comments that could be avoided as discriminatory or retaliatory in nature. Things such as, this job really requires a lot of energy. Do you still feel like you have that energy to give? Not the best type of comment to be making, even though it may have been intended with only the best of motives. And make sure that performance evaluations are accurate, honest, and thorough.
Well, Eric, we want to be respective of your time, and thank you as always for coming in and speaking to us. And I'm sure if we get any other questions that trickle in afterwards, we'll try to be responsive to those as well. Thank you for everybody on the call, and for those of you in the Nashville area, stay safe out there.